Now we're going to look at calculating GDP using the expenditure approach, which will be the technique used for this class. In a very simple form, you're going to see that calculating GDP is simply adding up consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, which is exports minus imports. In class, normally I have a lot of questions here, and as people go through questions in the book or on quizzes or tests, they come up with more questions. So I'll try to do my best here to answer as much of those questions as possible and give you guys a bit of some of the difficulties going through in this process. So overall, if I look at this situation here, consumption is the consumption of all goods and services purchased by consumers. So that one's pretty straightforward. Until you start thinking, well, what about an imported good? So let's say you buy for, I don't know, like $50 worth of a certain good coming from India or anywhere else. Well, you think, well, okay, that's part of consumption, but it's not produced in Canada. So why does it count towards GDP? Well, if you go all the way to the end here, you see that total imports, those things that are imported as well, this $50 of value will be counted here as well. So that $50 that adds to GDP in this consumption part will be removed from GDP in this import part. So eventually, well, not eventually, but essentially, these two will just cancel out and will not count. Okay, so that's just one thing to highlight, and I'll have other questions relating to that in a bit. Investments, the complicated one, so I'll just skip it. Government spending. It's government spending on goods and services purchased by the government, and it includes the salaries, but not employment insurance payments. So the reason why it doesn't include any of these unemployment insurance or welfare or other forms of payments, those are seen as just a transfer of wealth. If you would think about your parents giving you money to be in school, well, if they give you $1,000, unless you're giving them something in exchange, there's no exchange of goods and services. So that's just simply a transfer of wealth. Same thing goes for the government. So we only really count whatever they spend that eventually, not eventually, that leads to a certain service or a good purchased by them. Net exports is total exports minus total imports. And then investment is probably the one that some people struggle with the most, so I'll just spend a little bit more time here. When we think about investment, the big thing to keep in mind here is the idea that this is not what we'll later refer to as savings. We'll see that they're related. We'll see in the closed economy that they're equal to one another, and then we'll see in the open economy how different it could be. But here we're not thinking about stocks, the purchase of stocks, bonds, or any other financial instruments. We're thinking investment in this form of buying fixed investment for your businesses. So like if you're building a new plant or you're buying equipment, whether that's a video camera, computer, a car, a truck, any kind of machinery that you may need counts there. As well, new residential structure counts. So if you build a new house, that counts as part of GDP. But if you sell your house to someone else, that's not part of GDP because there's nothing being produced. You're just transferring ownership of a good. Same thing as buying a used car doesn't count towards GDP, or buying a stock doesn't count towards GDP because we're really just transferring ownership in all of those cases. Inventory investment is where things could get a little bit tricky, but when we talked about the bread early on and we talked about the idea of having a certain amount of wood, that could count towards inventory investment if it hasn't been used in that year, but there's all of that beginning stuff that was produced, so you can have inventory investment in intermediate goods. But you could also think about the idea that, let's say Apple releases a new MacBook and it's only going to be sold next year. It's only going to put to market next year, but they all get produced this year. Well, GDP looks at what's being produced in a given year, so you really want to make sure that you count it in that given year. So what would typically happen is in that specific year where the computers are produced, they would count in GDP as part of inventory investment. The next year when they would get sold, inventory investment would go down and consumption would go up, but these would more or less cancel out depending on how they were recorded. Because essentially when you're counting the value of what's being produced, there might be a little bit more because there's certain services involved and so on, but overall you're really trying to put when we calculate GDP, we're trying to establish what's the value of all goods and services that were produced in a given year. What kind of value do we have there? So let's see some extra kind of questions that might trick you. So how does the depreciation come into play? So we think about depreciation when we think about equipment. So if I have a computer or I have something else, and my accounting statements, I'll have my equipment figure, and let's say in a specific year, let's just say I have $2,000 worth equipment, and in the next year I have $8,000 worth of equipment. Well, you would think that over the course of this year, I acquired $3,000 worth of equipment. The thing that you have to keep in mind from an accounting standpoint is that when you have equipment, whatever it may be, a chainsaw or anything else, over the course of that year, the equipment is going to lose value. So the next year, if you don't make any purchases, this whole equipment may drop by 20% or something else because you have a certain level of depreciation. So the value of the computer, that chainsaw, that car, or whatever else has less value. So to go from 4,000 to now this new figure that appears in your books of 8,000, you actually acquired $4,000 worth of goods, which is essentially the difference that you observe plus the depreciation amount, which was this $1,000 here. So 3,000 plus 1,000 would be the total purchases of equipment. So either way that you see it, depreciation, you could either see it, what's the new depreciated value and what's the difference there, and that's how much I purchase, or it could be the difference in value between the 2 years plus what was my declared depreciation level, and add those up. Either way, you'll get to 1,000 plus 3,000, you'll have 4,000, or 4,000 here, it's the same thing. Okay, so that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. How do imports such as Italian espresso machines or anything else come into play in terms of GDP? Well, would it have the same impact if it was money that was not originally spent versus money that was used to buy a Canadian good? Yes, because if we think about that, like we said, buying any of these goods will have an impact on consumption. But if that consumption was initially spent on something else, so let's say this machine cost $2,000, well, it was spent on a Canadian good, and now it's no longer spent on a Canadian good, it's spent on an Italian good. Well, that consumption amount, since we consume 2,000 in both cases, won't change, but now we'll have this import amount of 2,000, which we saw in that equation, that we have consumption, but later on in the equation we have negative imports. So it's going to lead to GDP falling because the consumption part will not change, but the import part will. If it's a good that was, if you borrow money to buy a good that's imported, it just won't have any change on GDP because that good wasn't consumed before, so you'll have an increase in consumption of this, let's say 2,000, and you'll have an increase in imports which has negative signs of this 2,000 as well, and these will cancel out. So if you borrow money to buy an imported good, you're not contributing to GDP, you're not making it worse, you're not increasing it. It's essentially you're buying a good that is not produced here, and that money didn't go for anything else before, so you're not really making things worse. But if you decide to buy less Canadian goods in favor of more imported goods, well, then you'll have a situation where GDP is going to go down because the import figure will go up. Different things to keep in mind. I kind of talked about this a little bit here. So securities are not counted, especially when it's like if you just buy stock that was already emitted. We're not talking about IPOs here, so stocks that were already on the market, and this is a transfer in ownership. Same thing as private and government transfers if we're just talking about monetary transfers. Buying of second-hand cars, houses, snowboards, anything that you buy second-hand. I wasn't produced. Someone else owned it, it was accounted for when he bought it or she bought it, but then afterwards it's not double counted. And here's the interesting one that you might have some quiz questions on, so keep this one in mind, is household production. When you produce things at home, those things, if we think about the value of goods and services produced by a society, should be included, but they can't because we don't have a transaction record. So if all of a sudden I go from producing my meals myself and I hire someone to produce those same meals for me, I eat the same thing, the same amount of different ingredients are purchased, everything's the same, but now I hire someone and I pay them, and this is, once again, it's not an illegal transaction, which I'll get to in a second, so it is declared. Well, that's going to increase GDP. So by having someone else do your things, it increases GDP. And if we think historically, going from when many women would stay at home with the kids and produce a lot of things themselves, to starting to work and then hiring someone to take care of the kids, hiring someone for the food, hiring someone for this, hiring someone for that. Well, all of those things made it seem as though GDP goes up because all of those things are now recorded transactions, which they weren't in the past. So if people either get in the labor force and produce things, or they drop out and produce it for themselves and don't declare it, or even if it's declared, if you produce your own food, like, it's not illegal. So that has an impact there. And some other kinds of legal and illegal transactions. So obviously drug money, it does not contribute to GDP, but if certain drugs or certain products that were illegal become legal all of a sudden and now are declared and now are part of GDP, well, we could think that as soon as any of these illegal products become legal, GDP is going to go up. So here's a Canadian example if you want to have an idea of what's going on. So this is in a total, and this is billions per year. I'm guessing this is around 2015 or so. I don't have the exact date. It's from the 7th edition of the textbook. But essentially, we could see that consumption is the biggest part of total GDP, and that income per person, or gross domestic product per person, is around $55,000 on average. And we have consumption, we have investment, we have government purchases, and then net exports. You could see that our trade balance is pretty balanced. So we export a lot and we import a lot as well. Like, if we think about it in value, our exports and our imports are greater than our investment or government purchases, and a good chunk of our consumption. However, we export pretty much the same value as we import. So in this case here, it may seem as though this is like a closed economy, that net exports don't count because they cancel out. But at the same time, about a third of our gross domestic product is exported. A third of the value of what we produce is exported of our GDP. So not necessarily a third of what we produce, but like a third of the value. So it's a big chunk. So we're a quite open economy. So hopefully you understand all of these components, how they all work, and you're able to calculate them and have a better idea of how it's set up in the economy. And here the whole idea of having per person is really important when we talk about GDP. Have it on a per person basis, otherwise it's really hard to compare different countries.